A few years ago, I was filming a Jubilee-style discussion between the UNSW Greens and UNSW Conservatives, and from that experience of having to manage a debate with such polarizing groups, I learned a lot about the importance of making sure these interviews are conducted ethically, from the production to on the day to then the edits as well. We're also meant to have the socialist alternatives on the interview discussion, but you guys didn't want to be a part of it, so that's your loss. We gave you the right to reply. Another important note, but I think there's a lot here that really a lot of professional journalists could learn from, because as I'm sure many of you know, some of these interviews and things that you watch, you just think this is harming society more than it is providing any benefit. I also studied media, philosophy, commerce. I've got a broad range. I've been working in media for years, so. But I mean, first up, with just the line of questioning can frame completely how a topic is viewed to an audience. So you start off with, is global warming real? Then it's, well, how bad is climate change really? And then it's, how much is the climate crisis going to cost? By discussing these issues in this terminology, doesn't frame it as, this is a big issue, how are we going to solve it? It's, well, is it really a big enough issue to warrant taking action on? And even from the other perspective, going from global warming to climate change to climate crisis, is just a way to, in people's minds, increase the urgency for taking action on the issue.
When you take something abstract, an abstract concept like climate change, how do you communicate this in a way that connects with people? Now, there was a study done by a guy called Stephen Flusberg at Harvard, I think in 2017. And what he found was that using war metaphors made people more likely to accept that there was an urgent need to tackle climate change. But then you have Greta Thunberg comes out and says, our house is on fire, 5 words. And that, for me, is got to be much better than war metaphor, because you're taking this thing.
It's war but personal.
Yeah, and you're turning it into a domestic thing. And it also invokes the idea of like the world as a family. And of course, if our house is on fire, you can't sit around and wait for politicians to act. You've got to act yourself, and you've got to act now. So it creates a frame in which you're much more likely to agree.
And even the people that you can have on in these discussions, right? If you look at it from the Chomsky perspective of, you only get interviews or you only get access to the political media elite if you are in good standing with them. You're not going to get an interview with a politician if you've been bashing them for months on their policies. But you are going to get that interview with them, you are going to get that access and hence further promotion in your career if you are nice to them. So it creates an environment where you lose this journalistic integrity because you can only interact with the people who agree with you, even if you have the best of intentions. And like, you got to be careful as well for the previously mentioned discussion that I worked on. And I use the term discussion rather than debate, because to win is to learn, to win isn't to defeat the other side. But it was like an hour-and-a-half discussion between these two representatives that I had to cut down into 20 minutes, and it took me like a week to do this. Because you were trying to remove 60% of their points, 60% of their rebuttals, without undermining what they are saying or the intention of what they are trying to say. So how do you remove the vast majority of what they are saying while maintaining their perspective? And then, okay, if part of something they say I find a factual inaccuracy, just something simple, do I leave that in there because that's what they said? But I'm also removing a lot of it anyway, so should I just put that in the bin of stuff that I removed to maintain their integrity and not like get them embarrassed because they just made a slip up of like a number? But then is that undermining my integrity because I am not representing them as they were in the room? But then, does it really have that much of an impact? Because then you might have the possibility of them misinforming the audience. Well, then do you put a label saying that stat was wrong, but if that stat wasn't really needed anyway because you already have a whole heap of discussion that was talking about that, is it just better to remove it? And you have all of these things going through your mind, and that's why it's so important to have a certain ethical standing and understanding of the situation and real focus on trying to represent things in the best way possible. And, you know, like, even if you're talking about issues of that discussion, you have two people. You're having a situation where you're pretending a discussion is 50-50 when it's fundamentally not. You know, you talk about when you had all the climate crisis debates throughout the past 30, 40 years, where you have a denier versus a scientist, and you're like, it's not a 50-50 discussion. I think John Oliver did it best, you know, in terms of physically representing what an actual debate would be.
Last Week Tonight presents a statistically representative climate change debate.
In the interest of mathematical balance, I'm going to bring out 2 people who agree with you, climate skeptic, and Bill Nye, I'm also going to bring out 96 other scientists It's a little unwieldy, but this is the only way you can actually have a representative discussion. And what is the overwhelming view of the entire scientific community? Well... Okay. Any response to that? Any response? I can't hear you over the weight of scientific evidence. This whole debate should not have happened.
And additionally, not just analysing the people in front of the camera, but also analysing the people behind the camera from another Chomsky perspective of the importance of understanding who the interviewer is. Because I'm the one who's writing the questions, I'm the one who's framing the discussion, I'm the one who's going back into the edits. It's like how for my magazine, which hopefully should be coming out soon, I thought it was very important to, at the beginning, have something written about who I was. Because while it doesn't really matter who I am in terms of that's not the points of discussion here, it matters because I'm the person behind the text. I'm the one who's discussing whatever the topics are and framing them in certain ways and coming to certain conclusions that you're then using as information to improve your world understanding. So it's important to know who I am, where I come from. Because if I lived in America, my perspective would be very different than if I lived in Scandinavia, if you're talking about from an economics business perspective. So there's lots of important factors there that invaluable insights that can be gained from understanding who is behind the lens. I think as well, what is really dangerous about the way a lot of these debates are talked about is, as I mentioned prior, having one person that represents an entire group, or the misconception that there's such thing as a left or right, a progressive or conservative. They're fictitious concepts that we have come up with because we as humans need to categorize things. It's when does a mountain start, when does it end? If I love immigration, but I am destined on a free market economy, well, that doesn't fit with most conservative parties. And one of the things that really annoyed me is I saw a very prominent YouTuber advertise a service that basically tried to say, well, here's how the media is talking about this issue from a progressive and conservative, a left and right standpoint. And I'm your intentions are there, but you've completely misunderstood the issue here. The issue is there is no left and right. And by doing so, you further create a divide because you create this tribalism where people feel part of an identity group and feel like they have to act that way, think that way, regardless of what other natural learnings and experiences with the world should have on their internal thoughts, feelings, and emotions. The fact that people love labeling so much, I'd have discussions with people years ago and they'd automatically chuck me into a group, and then every preconception that they have with that group, they would associate with me regardless of my actual standing. And then once again, we're reinforcing this chasm that isn't actually there. Digging this hole further, I remember at one point in uni we had to have this was an actual debate, and it was about the legitimacy of Adani going ahead with his coal mine, which was a very scandalous thing in Australia because it was just terrible and it was put through anyway. And I was on the pro-Adani side, and I completely and utterly dominated that debate because while I was spewing disgusting and false information, I was doing it with far more confidence and far more ability to sound intelligent regardless of the accuracy of my points. So we as interviewers have got to understand and help convey to the audience that even though someone is saying something confidently, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. And we've got to help bring these things back down, that just because someone is louder, just because someone is more confident, it doesn't mean that they're the ones we should be listening to. That sometimes the most quiet, the most thoughtful are the ones who are actually have a much deeper understanding of these issues and how to potentially solve them. And part of the problem is the modes of distribution that we have created, where you have short form snippets and media bites through just clips on the news or social media, where you have to convey extremely complex issues and extremely complex solutions into just a couple of seconds. And that means you're not really getting a true glimpse of what is at stake here and what are ways we can resolve this potential crisis. And that means, once again, it favors the people who can shout the loudest and the most confidently rather than the most thoughtful ones. And this also means it reinforces this tribalism because it's I have 5 seconds to tell you why I'm good and they're bad, rather than realizing that most people who seem to be on opposite sides of political spectrums actually agree on the issues at hand. What tends to be the problem is how do we solve these issues? So how within a discussion or debate format do you emphasize this fact that these people aren't the ones who are in complete disagreements, that really we're all friends in this. It's just really now about the point of what do we as a society think is the best way to resolve this? And part of it is our fault as an audience, where we demand simple solutions and simple explanations of issues where there is none. So it once again forces these politicians and representatives and spokespeople to talk like there is one. And then you can go into the whole philosophical perspective of ontology and epistemology, and is there such thing as truth? Not really, because it depends on our interpretation of this supposed world around us, and you go into Descartes of I think therefore I am, and you get into this mess of understanding truth. But to put that all aside, move the philosophers out of the way, because they just make everything annoying and complex and important, but not the point of this discussion. And there are facts, and you've got to ensure that within these discussions, within these debates that we see, that we produce, that you don't let facts be debated. And once again, if you're really going to the deep philosophical perspective, it's important to debate facts and foundations and first principles of philosophy and whatever that may be. But for the simplistic point of discussions, things like the legitimacy of the climate crisis, things like who won the US election, you can't let these be points of debate, because then that undermines actually moving on to the important points of discussion of this is the situation we're in, democracy is on the edge of collapse, how do we pull ourselves away from the edge and ensure that society can still thrive for at least the next century. I remember at one point seeing a podcaster, a prominent podcaster, I can't remember his name. He was talking about how in the beginning he grew by giving his podcast guests revision rights. They'd be able to look at it afterwards and basically decide, do I want to cut bits out or do I want to leave certain bits? And while that may be ethical from an artistic perspective, for example, my photography, right? You run them past people, hey, are you happy for this to go up or be finished or whatever it may be? It's extremely detrimental to do that from a journalistic perspective. So I think there also needs to be a clear differentiation there where if you're giving people editorial rights, that means that is not journalism. That is a promotional piece, because they are unlikely to give you permission to publish stuff that makes themselves look bad, and therefore the only things that do get published, the only things that do get out into the world, are things that portray them in a positive light, which may in this one instance be journalistic, but compromises everything else that you produce. I know you're talking about the influence Murdoch has on the media space. It's not that, well, sometimes he does, but most of the time it's not that he tells journalists what to write, but you only get hired at a newspaper, you only get hired at a TV station if your views reflect that of the lead and senior editors. And you will only get promoted if, I assume, your articles and posts and things like that get to front page, get lots of attention. And they'll get to front page because, once again, your thoughts and opinions and analyses agree with the senior editors, which means you don't really have true journalistic freedom because you're forced to operate within a system that squashes you to a certain way or join a group of people which already agree with you. And that creates issues in itself. Interviews used to be moderated by gatekeepers. You had to be on the BBC or the ABC to really get a shot at being heard, which meant to some degree you can maintain a sense of ethical standards and journalistic practices because those people had no choice but to appear on those stations. But now with social media, everyone can shout into their little crowd and undermines the ability to keep this all together. But then the benefit is that people who couldn't get past the gatekeepers originally now have a voice. And that's why things now with the TikTok ban, which is just a hugely disruptive, corrupt policy, this application has given the ability for small people like us to put our voices into the world, put our perspectives. You see ground views of what it is like in war zones and places in huge distress that journalists just wouldn't have been able to get into otherwise, or see perspectives from people that generally weren't interviewed before and really see what life is actually like for normal, regular civilians like us. And I mean, trying to maintain this journalistic integrity and put pressure on people in power who are potentially screwing us, it comes with risks, right? Me putting this out now is like, I'm not breaking any defamation laws, but it doesn't mean people won't sue me for defamation. I'm trying to put a perspective out there into the world that basically promotes a society which is much healthier and better for the majority, and yet there will be people who completely disagree with this and say that the status quo is the best we'll ever get. Well, once again, you don't want to breach freedom of speech in terms of people's abilities to think one another. You've got to be careful that you will receive opposition, sometimes from the odd commenter, but more scarily from, once again, these people in positions of power who have significantly more money and significantly more influence against you, who are there to maintain that status quo at all costs. So overall, I think journalists need to take a bigger focus, a bigger priority on ensuring that there is a level of ethics within their occupation. Because our current system where our entire traditional news space is owned by two organisations in Australia, and that we have to abide by the certain modes of distribution that forms the way we ask questions and the reactions we're trying to hope for, and that we're a headline reading society so we don't go into depth on a 3-hour discussion of a complex issue rather than just hoping for a quick line here or there to understand this supposed complex issue. It is so important that we align all these things in the most effective way possible to ensure that society can develop into the best version that it possibly can be, and that despite these pressures forcing us downwards, that we fight back, because the more we fight back, the more we pressure, these systems will then be designed around this pressure. We will elect politicians who better represent our views. We will pressure social media platforms to design systems that reflect the way that we want to watch media, that we don't want headline reading culture, we want in-depth discussions. We don't want people to shout at us, we want the people who are thoughtful and provide the most value. So overall, I think you need to take this approach, whether you're an interviewer or a producer, or whether you're an audience member and viewer, to all of these discussions, debates, interviews down the line, because it is essential for us to really progress and for democracy to survive long term.